John chapter 7. Hey, it's on there. As we go into chapter 7, leaving chapter 6, we saw that Jesus declared himself as the bread of life. And he called for belief from those that were following him to eat and drink of him. And man, that was hard words for them. And these are things the crowd did not want to hear. And they came to Jesus for Jesus to serve them, to provide them for bread and to satisfy their stomachs, to take charge of their lives and kick Rome out of Israel and those kinds of things. This whole idea of submitting to Jesus in this way was not what they expected. John then records Peter's profession of faith, which is somewhat representative of the true followers of Christ, those true disciples. Where else would we go, Jesus? There is no other way, that he alone was the way to forgiveness. He alone was the path to righteousness. And so as we move into chapter 7, we see the lines are being formed. We see the call for all to believe. We see some just turn away in unbelief, and we see others then realizing and grasping that commitment to him. And we see the development of the idea that most would turn away and few would follow, which is consistent with several places in the scriptures. As the lines were being formed in this chapter 6, we see that Jesus was in Galilee. We see the different groups that were present. Primarily, we see the disciples being sort of formed up more, being referred to as disciples. We see Peter show up in there. And then we see this multitude chasing after him, wanting and calling for things. But in reality, most of them are characterized by unbelief. And so as we go into chapter 7, we enter into a transition to sort of the Judean ministry. So Galilee would be up around the Sea of Galilee. Galilee is home base in Capernaum. And now he's going to make his way to Israel again and bring this ministry into Judea. And we see the Judean perspective then. We see the groups. We see the Jews, and which is this idea of those Jewish leadership referred to as the Jews. And they have unbelief that ran so deep that they decided that Jesus had to die, that they were going to kill him. And then we see the crowd in Judea that similar to this multitude. The multitude was following. The crowd is standing aside, forming their opinion, looking on him and saying, what is this about? Right? And so we see that opinion being formed by the crowd. As in chapter 6, we were in a Passover season. When we go to chapter 7, we're going to be into Feast of Tabernacles. So we have moved from the spring Passover season to the fall Feast of Tabernacles. So somewhere around 6 months passes between chapter 6 and chapter 7. Verse 1. After these things, Jesus walked in Galilee, for he did not want to walk in Judea, because the Jews sought to kill him. Now the Jews' feast of tabernacles was at hand. His brothers therefore said to him, depart from here and go into Judea, that your disciples also may see the works that you are doing. For no one does anything in secret while he himself seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. Verse 5. For even his brothers did not believe in him. And John throws that last line in, seems to be explaining why his brothers were saying this, which appears to be his brothers mocking him in unbelief. It's consistent with the messianic prophecy, says that I have become a stranger to my brothers and an alien to my mother's children. Matthew 13:54 tells us that those brothers' names were James and Joseph, Simon and Judas. And Jesus' brothers would have been essentially his half-brothers, had rejected him, did not believe, and so they become this sort of a picture of unbelief that close to him within that family circle, And they become that picture of unbelief, representative of the unbelief that we've seen in the sort of multitude. Jesus walked in Galilee, ministered in Galilee, and in this effort to control the timing. Jesus wasn't afraid to go to the Feast of Tabernacles. He wasn't afraid to go down to Judea. But he was simply controlling the timing because they sought to kill him. And he knew he was always pacing towards a day, a specific day. He controlled that timing all the way through. And so his brothers appears to be mocking him. It's like, if you want to be a famous rabbi, you need to go down, because everybody, all the people went to the Feast of Tabernacles, and Jerusalem would be just overflowing with people in this celebration. It was a huge feast. So the Feast of Tabernacles is one of the three most important festivals of the Jewish year, and the Jewish pilgrims throughout this region would gather, and men would live in booths constructed on their rooftops or sometimes out in the field. I remember reading, and this was to commemorate God's faithfulness to his people when they lived in booths in the wilderness. And so it was in a looking back at the wilderness wandering and God's faithfulness and care for his children. And the feast was a joyous celebration in doing this. And so this was I think it technically was a 7-day celebration, but it got extended to 8 days somewhere in there. So you can see it both ways when you study it. I think like the 8th day was added in somewhere along the line. Let's go on to verse 6. When Jesus said to them, "My time has not yet come, but your time is already always ready. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify of it that its works are evil. You go up to this feast, and I am not yet going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come." Verse 9, when he had said these things to them, he remained in Galilee. So again, as the brothers become this example of the world as John presents this, sort of this picture that men love darkness. This is the condemnation that was on the world and on men, that men love darkness instead of light, and they become this representative. Verse 10, when his brothers had gone up, then he also went up to the feast, not openly, but as it were in secret. And so this bothers a lot of people because they go, like, Jesus lied to his brothers. And and you really got to kind of work at that to make that a lie. But Jesus said that time had not yet come. I'm not going at this time. I'm not going yet is the word that is translated there, that I'm not going up yet. But his brothers left, and then once the feast was underway, he went. They were looking for a Jesus to come that had this massive following and all these people with him. And Jesus went in secret. And the fact that Jesus could go in secret means that Jesus looked like just anybody else coming to this huge feast. And for a man to travel into this feast by himself would not stand out in the crowd. Jesus didn't have a glowing aura about him or anything like that. He was a typical man, everything we see about him. And so he could go, and this is what it means he went in secret. He just went as a man to this worship by himself. They were looking for someone that was drawing a crowd. Verse 11, then the Jews sought him at the feast, and they said, "Where is he?" And verse 12, and there was much complaining among the people concerning him. Some said, he is good. Others said, no, on the contrary, he deceives people. However, no one spoke openly of him for the fear of the Jews, the fear of the leadership. And so Jesus goes in private, and he hears this opinions being formed about him. As the leadership says, "Where is he?" They sought after him, which, if you look at that, that's somewhat insider information. How does John know what these leaders were thinking and what they were saying? And you got to think this is information that came from Nicodemus and later Joseph of Arimathea, or one of those guys at a later date. Several times we get this sort of insider information of what was going through the head of leadership. They said, where is he? And the people are forming their opinion about Jesus. And it says they're complaining. The word is murmuring, grumbling. Murmur, murmur, grumble. This is the crowd all whispering and talking amongst themselves. What do you think? Everybody had an opinion, right? Everybody had an opinion about Jesus, and they were forming their opinion. Well, I don't think, and some said he is good. Some say he deceives his people. And we kind of read that quickly, that he deceives his people, but it's actually a pretty heavy charge. And because what they're talking about is a reference back to Deuteronomy 13. And in Deuteronomy 13 is where, hey, if a man comes to town and he is leading people astray, then you have to respond to that. It says, but that prophet or dreamer that dreams dreams shall be put to death, because he has spoken in order to turn you away from the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of bondage, to entice you from the way in which the Lord your God commanded you to walk. So you shall put away the evil from your midst. And so they're pointing to Jesus, saying he's a deceiver. And the word means he's one that leads people away from God. And so some people are looking at him and calling him apostate. Now, this wasn't unusual in Judea. This happened frequently. Josephus writes of one particular case. Actually, he wrote of several, I think, but I just pulled one example out. It came to pass while Thaddeus was procurator of Judea, that a certain magician whose name was Theudas, he persuaded a great part of the people to take their effects with them and follow him to the river Jordan. For he told them that he was a prophet, and that he would by his own command divide the water and afford them an easy passage over it. And many were deluded by his words. And however, Thaddeus did not permit them to take any advantage of this wild attempt, but he sent a troop of horsemen out against him, who falling upon them unexpectedly slew many of them and took many of them alive. And they also took Theudas alive, and they cut off his head, carried it to Jerusalem. And this is what befell the Jews at that time. So this is just like this is actually 10 years after Christ. But there are many examples of these people that were coming in, and for this man to claim he's a prophet and he's going to divide the water, that sounded like a Moses type thing to them, you know. And they were always looking for this Moses-like prophet. And here is Christ in their midst, and some of them are forming the opinion that he's a deceiver. He's one of those that are going to lead us away, and he needs to die. And that's really what they're saying, is they agree that he should die. Opinions were being formed. Who is this Jesus? Verse 14. Now about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and taught. And the Jews marveled, saying, how does this man know letters, having never studied? What they're saying is that he never formally studied under other rabbis. And so normally when someone would teach in the temple, there was lots of people teaching at the temple. And they would teach about a passage of the scriptures, and they say, well, Rabbi so-and-so, he says this. And this other rabbi, he says this. And this rabbi, and so they had these references. And it's much like I do as I'm teaching. I talk about what Spurgeon, you quote Spurgeon, you quote a commentator. I Craig Keener all the time. I have sort of these resources that I go. And this is what they're talking about. Jesus didn't do any of that. He had one source. And he says, my one source is my Father. And this befuddles them. They've never seen anybody like this. He's like, how does he know to do this? Because he's never had any sort of formal education, and he never studied under this. Verse 16. Jesus answered them and said, my doctrine is not mine, but his who sent me. Like he didn't just show up and make this up to seek a following of himself. If anyone wills to do his will, talking about his Father, he shall know concerning the doctrine, whether it is from God or whether I speak of my own authority. He who speaks from himself seeks his own glory, but he who seeks the glory of the one who sent him is true, and no unrighteousness is in him. So he establishes the doctrine that he is teaching comes from the Father. It is for the purpose of glorifying the Father. And it was a rule to sort out those false teachers that are going to glorify themselves and bringing their own doctrine and their own thoughts. Then he says in verse 19, did not Moses give the law, yet none of you keeps the law? Why do you seek to kill me? They were after him primarily, as John presents it, for healing this man on the Sabbath on his previous visit to Jerusalem. Remember the man that had been afflicted for 38 years, lame for 38 years, and Jesus had healed him as he had waited alongside the pool to get in the pool. Jesus healed him after 38 years. And he went right to the authorities, and this became the problem for Jesus, that he had healed on the Sabbath. And so they were seeking to kill him because of this, that he had violated the Sabbath. And he's saying, did not Moses give you the law, yet none of you keeps the law? Why do you seek to kill me? Seems like there is a commandment that says, thou shalt not kill. They seem to have forgotten that. Verse 20. The people answered and said, you have a demon who is seeking to kill you. Not only do they have murder on their heart, but now they got a lie on their record. They're standing before the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. They're standing before God the Son and saying, you have a demon. They call it chutzpah. That's insane. That's crazy. That they had no more respect or even thoughtfulness to consider what they were doing. Accused Jesus of having a demon and lied right to him. Said, no, we're going to try to kill you. What are you talking about? 21, Jesus answered and said to them, I did one work. As far as they saw, there was one work. There was one work that was bothering them. I did one work and you marvel. Verse 22, Moses therefore gave you circumcision, not that it was from Moses, but from the fathers, and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. So to circumcise someone on the Sabbath was a violation of the law. Yet they were circumcised on the Sabbath to keep the law because they were supposed to circumcise on the 8th day. Yet when Jesus healed on the Sabbath day, they said, can't you just heal? You could have healed on another day, was one of the arguments. And in their keeping of the law, they automatically violate, and there's several things, whether it's the Feast of Tabernacles or the work that the priests are doing, and on and on. There's several things that say, well, these are violations, but they're okay. And so these are lesser violations to keep a higher law. Yes, it is a violation to work on the Sabbath and the circumcision, but the higher law is that we must circumcise and keep that law. Say at verse 23, if a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath so that the law of Moses should not be broken, are you angry with me because I made a man completely well on the Sabbath? Jesus had a higher law. He's saying, I have kept a higher law, and what he had done in healing this person was no different than what they had done. Even though their activity of circumcision was relatively a small thing. This man had been sick for 38 years and lame, and he healed the man, and they see a violation of the Sabbath, not keeping a higher law. Verse 24, do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. This is just a call for Jesus saying, why don't you use the same standard across the board in your judgments? You're inconsistent. You have a standard for yourself, but then you hold this other standard for everyone else, which we know what they had done with the Sabbath is they created rule after rule after rule after rule to where they couldn't do anything on the Sabbath. And some of it just seems so ridiculous. And this is what the Jews did with the Sabbath. They made it this pack of rules that you had to fret and worry about keeping instead of having this day of rest in the Lord. They lost the purpose of the law in the letter of the law. Jesus is calling for this judgment that is consistent across the board. There's a little side note here that's kind of fascinating. The Feast of Tabernacles that they were in the midst of, and all these people came to Jerusalem and they were celebrating, and it went on for this 7 to 8 days. And it celebrated the deliverance after the 38 years of wandering in the wilderness. 38 years of wandering in God's provision and then delivering them, that next generation through the wilderness. So Deuteronomy 2 says that it was 38 years from Kadesh Barnea until they had arrived, and all of that generation in that age group that the Lord had defined had passed away. 38 years. The man that had been afflicted that Jesus healed on the Sabbath had been sick for 38 years. And you go, they are celebrating this deliverance after 38 years, and yet Jesus delivered this man after 38 years, and they want to kill him for his work on the Sabbath. They're rejecting a higher purpose. Verse 25. Now some of them from Jerusalem said, "Is this not he whom they seek to kill? But look, he speaks boldly, and they say nothing to him." Do the rulers know indeed that this is truly the Christ? So they're starting to wonder. It's like, he's speaking boldly, he's saying some crazy stuff, and like they're not taking him. What's going on? Have they decided that he's legit, that he really is the Christ? And you see that their response is just putting more pressure on the Jewish leadership to act against Jesus. And so you see the pressure building, the sides are being, people are forming their opinion, and then the sides are being determined. Verse 27, however, we know where this man is from. This is the people said. We know where this man is from, but when Christ comes, no one knows where he was from. So many of there's some really crazy different variances amongst the Jews, the different teachings, and probably just different rabbis from different areas. But some anticipated a Messiah, sort of a secret Messiah. Nobody would know until, boom, he was on the scene, and he would come and kick Rome out and take charge and be this leader amongst his people. And so in their mind, nobody would know where this man was from, and no one would know who he was, but he would be this Moses-like figure that would come forward. Others saw this Moses-like prophet as someone completely different from their Messiah. So, and sometimes it's hard to see, but we see the comments of these folks that saying that we know where this man is from, and so he can't be anyone special. He can't be the Christ. Verse 28. Then Jesus cried out as he taught in the temple, saying, you both know me, and you know where I am from. And I have not come of myself, but he who sent me is true, whom you do not know. But I know him, for I am from him, and he sent me. They're saying, this Jesus guy is from Galilee. He can't be the Christ because he's from Galilee. And Jesus said, I'm from the Father. He's thinking in a spiritual sense, and the people are caught, the Jews and the people are caught in this very literal viewpoint, and we've seen this over and over just in these first 6, 7 chapters. Verse 30, therefore they sought to take him, but no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. Again, Jesus is always in control. No one laid a hand on him. No matter how you look at that, it has a supernatural element. I don't think it was some something that was really weird. I think it was just that no one had the timing, the place, the opportunity, whatever it was. Nobody took that initiative. And I believe it was how you slice it. It has a supernatural element to it because Christ is in control of that timing. Verse 31. And many of the people believed in him and said, when the Christ comes, he will do more signs than these which this man has done. And so you see again that many believed on him, and in their belief they said, when the Christ comes, he's going to do more things. So their belief was at some level where they believed he was maybe this Moses-like prophet, but they did not believe that he was Messiah. Verse 32. The Pharisees heard the crowd murmuring, murmur, grumbling. And I imagine the Pharisees heard them saying, they're not doing anything. Does that mean he is the Christ? Have they decided he is okay? That would not be okay with the Pharisees. The Pharisees heard the crowd murmuring these things concerning him, and the Pharisees and the chief priests sent officers to take him. Pharisees had no authority to arrest anybody. The Pharisees had no, but the officers did. They used the temple guard. The temple guard were the ones that had any kind of sort of authority to do this kind of thing. So those in power sort of got the temple guard to go do their work. Verse 33, then Jesus said to them, I shall be with you a little longer, and then I go to him who sent me. You will seek me and not find me, and where I am, you cannot come. And the Jews, again, you're talking about, John says the Jews, talking about that leadership group, said amongst themselves, where does he intend to go, that we shall not find him? Again, you see this very literal mindset approach to what Jesus' words say. Does he intend to go to the dispersion among the Greeks, teach the Greeks? Verse 36, what is this thing that he said, you will seek me and not find me, and where I am, you cannot come? It was fascinating that John records those words that are like, what does he mean by this? And you just wonder down the road when they understand and they see a resurrected Christ ascend to the Father, or they hear about it, they go, hey, maybe that's what he meant. It was like a seed planted along the way. So you could see the tension building. You see the tension building. You see opinions being formed. And all of this is in the context of the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, the Feast of Tabernacles, every morning during this feast, the great multitude would gather in the morning, and they would carry, they say they carry a citrus fruit called an ethrog in their left hand. So they all had this fruit in their left hand, and this was a reminder of the land that God had brought them to, and the many blessings of the promised land. In the right hands, they carried the lulab. I'm probably not saying that right, but it was a combination of leaves from 3 different trees, a palm tree, a willow tree, and a myrtle tree. And these were emblematic of the stages of their ancestors' journey through the wilderness. And so they got a fruit in one hand, they got some leaves in the other hand, right? And they gather, this multitude gathers every morning. And each morning they would, with these things in their hands, follow the priest to the pool of Siloam. And the priest would be carrying a golden pitcher. And all along the way they would chant psalms and wave their fruit and their palms, their branches. When they got to the pool, the priest would dip the pitcher into the pool, and the people would say, quote Isaiah, therefore you will joyously draw water from the springs of salvation. And then the crowd would march back to the temple, following the priest with his pitcher of water. They'd enter the water gate. The trumpets would blast, and the priest would approach the altar. The parade would circle around the altar, and the accompanying priest ascended to the platform to pour out the water. He'd begin to pour out the water, and they'd say, higher, higher, and he'd lift the higher, and they'd say, higher, higher, And it was a great thing for them to see the water poured out. All the crowd shouted with him to hold it higher, and it was considered the height of joy in a person's life if they could see the water being poured out onto the altar. And as the water poured out, they sang Psalm 118, Save now, O Lord. O Lord, I pray, send now prosperity. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And the water would be poured out at the altar. It was water that was sort of emblematic of the rain, of the provision, the living water that was provided for them in the wilderness. And so that's kind of the context of this. And then the final day of this celebration, the priest would go to the pool, but then he would come back with an empty pitcher. And as he went to the altar, everybody would say, lift it higher, lift it higher. But when he turned it, there was no water in it. It was empty. And it's emblematic of having arrived in the promised land. And now the land is your provision. The land flowing with milk and honey. And the land that God would bring rains. And it was emblematic of having arrived in the promised land. There's many that think that when that pitcher was turned in this particular instance, and that the water flowed out, is when Jesus speaks up in verse 37. On the last day, that great day of the feast, Jesus stood and cried out, saying, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. He who believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. But this he spoke concerning the Spirit, whom those believing in him would rejoice, for the Holy Spirit was not yet given, because Jesus was not yet glorified. Imagine that moment when the priest turned the pitcher and it was quiet amongst the crowd, and Jesus begins to shout that he is that living water. What a moment. My goodness. That's one of the replays I want to see when we get to heaven. How incredible. And John puts his commentary that Jesus is speaking about the Spirit that will well up in us. Verse 40, therefore, many from the crowd, when they heard this saying, said, truly this is the prophet. Others said, this is the Christ. Again, when they say that this is the Christ, they're putting more pressure on that leadership to get rid of Jesus, right? But some said, will the Christ come out of Galilee? Has not the scripture said that the Christ comes from the seed of David and from the town of Bethlehem, where David was? Verse 43, so there was division among the people because of him. That's a profound statement right there. That has been true forever, and it's still true today. There was division among the people because of him. Verse 44, now some of them wanted to take him, but no one laid hands on him. No one laid hands on him. Jesus is in control of that timing. Verse 45. Then the officers came to the chief priests and the Pharisees, who said to them, why have you not brought him? And the officers answered, no man has ever spoke like this. They had never seen anything like this. They had never seen anyone like this. They went and saw Jesus. They were supposed to go grab him and arrest him. And they heard Jesus speaking, and they're like, nobody's ever talked like this. Nobody's ever had this power in the words that they spoke, and not citing someone else's authority, and citing famous rabbis and saying they were repeating their word and gathering under the authority of all these other well-known teachers. But Jesus spoke of authority that had been given to him by the Father. Nobody had ever heard that. And often the way I like to think of it is, I think these guys said, it's like he wrote those words. Because he did. They had never seen anything like it. The Pharisees answered, are you also deceived? It's that same word, that idea. Have you been led astray by this guy? This apostate? Have you been led apostate too? This is the question they ask. And have any of the rulers of the Pharisees believed in him? This was like their highfalutin. Have you seen any of us Pharisees deceived by this man? Which is really ironic, and John loves irony. They had, verse 49, but this crowd that does not know the law is accursed. Here's John's irony. Nicodemus, who had come to Jesus by night, being one of them, said to them, does our law judge a man before it hears him and knows what he is doing? The Pharisee said, have you seen any of us deceived by this man, following after this man? And Nicodemus is like, hey, maybe we should listen to him. We don't know what Nicodemus' heart was at that point in time. There's a good chance that he was a believer at that moment. Verse 52, then they answered and said to him, are you also from Galilee? He's like, smack him, shut up and sit down. We didn't ask for anything from you, Nicodemus. Are you also from Galilee? Search and look, for no prophet has risen out of Galilee. And that's in their ignorance. They were wrong. And this is your homework. Look up later, 2 Kings 14:25. There is a prophet from Galilee. May have been more, but that's one that's in the scriptures. And so we see the opinions being formed and the verdicts. And this is from Barclay, is verdicts that he captures in this passage. There's the verdict that Jesus was a good man. There's the verdict that Jesus was a prophet. There is a verdict that he was a deluded madman. There's the verdict that he was a seducer. The verdict that he was a man of courage. The verdict that he had a most dynamic personality. And then there was the verdict that he was the Christ, the anointed one, the Son of God. Probably everybody's heard the quote from C.S. Lewis, but you can't pass it up here. It fits in this chapter, and you got to say it. This is C.S. Lewis. He says, you must make your choice. People were making choices, forming their opinion about Jesus. C.S. Lewis says, you must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else he was a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher, for he has not left that open to us, and he did not intend to. There's two choices there. Because one is belief in everything else. All the other junk that is all an unbelief. And usually those presentations of unbelief are in the context of protecting sin, protecting self. Let's bow our heads. Father, thank